Well, I'm delighted to welcome the Whisky Guru himself, Charles Maclean, onto my unique Scotland podcast. Charles, a very hearty Scottish welcome to you.
Thank you very much, John.
Great. And I'm going to be a bit naughty by not asking a technical question. I'd like to go straight into how was it being a film star in such an iconic movie, The Angel's Share, and working with Ken Loach?
Well, all I can say straight off is thank God it was a good movie, because it would have been awful to be associated with a real bummer, you know. It was a splendid experience. I was originally recruited as a script advisor. Now, the way Ken Loach works is that he doesn't tightly script it. He likes people to try and be themselves, and indeed, you know, hence, you know, like myself, I mean, he uses a lot of non-actors, and even the actors themselves are not tightly scripted. Mm. Nobody gets to see the whole script.
Yeah.
And I was sworn to secrecy because I had obviously seen the whole script. And so the cast gets the script for the day on the morning of that shoot. And so they know what's going to happen, but they're not expected to learn their words.
Wow.
Or very, very rarely. And so, as I say, so I went through and just made a couple of small suggestions here and there of this outline script.
Yeah.
And then it happened that I was doing, I had Gordon and MacPhail, who are whiskey people up in Elgin, and they'd recently bottled a very, very expensive bottle of whiskey. And then it was exactly the time of the tsunami in Japan. And so they wanted to auction one of these bottles. You know, you're talking about 12, 15 quid, it's £15,000.
Oh, okay.
And so I phoned, I do a certain amount of consultancy for Bonhams on old whiskies. And so I phoned the managing director of Bonhams and said, would you be happy to do a single lot auction? And they said, well, yeah, we'll do it, but we'll do it quickly. And I knew that Ken was shooting in Glasgow at the time, the date that was chosen. And I also knew, of course, that there was a single lot auction in the film, in this case of a cask of whiskey, not a bottle. And so I said to the producer, would you be interested to come through to Edinburgh and see this? Because single lot auctions are uncommon, you know.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
But just to get the vibe, you know, there'll be people coming in on the phone or on computers and what have you. And so she said, yeah, that'd be great, we'll come through. Mm-hmm. So they did. And then the following day, she phoned me, the producer, and said, well, that was really useful, thank you very much. And by the way, Ken would like you to have the role of Rory McAllister in the film.
Wow.
I said, but I'm not a bloody actor. I said, well, that's the point. That's the very point, you see. So that was how I got the job. And it was great working with him. He's a great old boy, he really is. And also working with the young, what I call the young kids, the stars, if you like.
Yes.
It was a great experience, and then of course it did very well. We had to go to yes. It was selected for Cannes. Indeed, won the second biggest prize at Cannes, the jury prize.
Yes,
and so Rebecca O'Brien, the producer, phoned me, and I was in Germany, as a matter of fact, and she said, we've been selected for Cannes. And I said, that's great, well done, that's terrific. Well, we'd like you to come too. And I said, oh, well, I'm not sure I can. You know, I do a regular teaching program for Diageo. And it happened to be that week. She said, what do you mean you're not coming to Cannes? And I said, well, I've got this obligation. She said, you must be joking. She said, there are parties and there is Cannes, you know, get somebody else to do the teaching. Yeah. So that was me in Cannes as well. It was a great experience. It was, and thank goodness, as I say, it's a nice film.
Yeah, phenomenal, and I thoroughly enjoyed the film as well.
Good.
Right. Okay, I'll get on to the technical stuff now. Can I first of all ask what was it that attracted you to whiskey? I mean, it sounds like an obvious question. I see you just sipping one as we chat. But how did you become so involved in the whiskey industry?
Oh, John. Well, it's a long story, but to cut it short, I spent most of the 1970s in various universities, St Andrews, then Dundee, then Edinburgh, doing an art history degree first in St Andrews, and then a law degree in Dundee, which I finished in Edinburgh University. Did my apprenticeship, my articles, and then knew that the law was not for me.
Mm-hmm.
And so I set up my plate as a literary agent in, I think it'd be 1977. And as soon as I finished my articles, I abandoned the law and went into this full time and promptly starved.
Mm-hmm.
And then, well, the upshot was that I became, well, originally started writing. I always aspired to be a writer, and so started ghost writing, helping people who had stories but couldn't write.
Yeah.
On behalf of publishers. So I'd be recruited by a publisher to help an author. And then writing under my own name, and my general topics were, broadly speaking, Scottish non-fiction. So clans, tartans, castles, the sort of stuff that you've done for your Blue Badge Guide, you know.
Yes, exactly.
And then commercial copywriting, working for advertising agencies, freelance, or mainly design agencies.
Mm-hmm.
And I came to whiskey because the first whiskey job that I did was a brochure for Bell's in 1981. And it happened that, you know, so I had the agency was still running, books still running, and I like to have a book on the back burner for when the commercial stuff, which was the main business,
Yes.
when that was slack.
Yes.
And come 88, I had considerable interest in. I'd done a lot of work by chance for numerous whiskey companies,
Mm-hmm.
Brochure work and reports and what have you. So I had a track record, and I also I was a published author.
Yeah.
So I made a proposal to a publisher for a book about Scotch whiskey, and that was signed up in 88 and published in 92. And from then on, it's been whiskey, and I've just finished my 18th book on the subject.
Wow. Okay. Yes. In fact, I think I put 17. I mentioned 17, but I noticed you sent me.
Well, one's in train. It hasn't yet.
Right.
It's with the publisher, but it hasn't yet been published.
Is that the Whisky Miscellany?
No, Miscellany was. Well, that was some years ago, but it's gone through several editions, and this one is called A History of Whiskey in 100 Objects.
Brilliant.
And I don't know when it'll appear. I'm hoping it will appear this September, but it may not be till next September for some extraordinary reason.
Okay. Well, we'll look out for it, Charlie. Thank you for
Good.
that. I know that you give tastings of whiskey all over the world, and with COVID lockdown, you've been conducting virtual tastings on the internet. Can you share with us a recent virtual seminar and maybe the sort of whiskey you tasted?
Well, I've got the most recent ones that I've been looking at are a number of cask samples. Can you see it? Yeah.
Yes, I can see that. Yeah.
We cask samples. Look at them. These are all Glenfarclas.
Right.
And I've just finished them. They're absolutely beautiful samples.
Wow. Yeah.
So what I would do to start with is I make a distinction between just drinking for enjoyment,
yes,
and drinking to appreciate. Mm-hmm. And in the case of malt whiskey in particular, so I mean, enjoy it as you like. You know, you may remember that in Glasgow it was very popular to put lemonade in whiskey.
Yes.
There would be bottles of lemonade on the bar top, you know, and you just help yourself. Horrible drink, but you know, if you like it with lemonade, if you like it with ginger ale, if you like it any way you like,
yes,
that's fine. You know, anyway, and but for appreciation,
yes,
the first thing is the glass.
Mm-hmm.
Now, a tumbler, the so-called standard whiskey glass. I'm drinking gin at the moment, by the way.
I'm not sure we should tell the listeners that, but go on.
Betraying my trade.
Yes.
That's fine just for drinking, but for appreciation, it depends as much on the aroma as on the taste.
Mm-hmm.
And a thing that people tend to forget is that flavor is by definition a combination of smell, taste, and texture. Mm-hmm. It's not just taste. We tend to think, oh, it's got a nice taste, nice flavor, but it combines these three. So glassware is fundamental. Then I say, well, now let's look at one of these samples. Oh God, this is a 1987 Glenfarclas, so I'll be sparing. But so then I pour a wee sample, And the glass should simply, a white wine glass is okay.
Yeah.
This sort of glass is called a spirits nosing glass. It's a sort of a specialist. It's a copita, essentially, the sort of thing you drink sherry with.
Mm-hmm.
You swirl it. Well, first of all, you look at the color. And this has got a deep sort of amber, in fact, more umber, sort of browny, polished mahogany, you know?
Yes.
Now, that tells me immediately that it's been matured in a European oak sherry cask. It's been treated with sherry.
Right.
But the paler ones, you see, that's slightly paler, you can maybe see.
Yes.
Now, that's more likely to be American oak. The casks are either made from American oak or from European oak.
Mm-hmm.
And the European oak is more tannic and gives a deeper color. It's like tea, tannins in tea.
Yes.
So you judge the color, you guess the cask, and of course sometimes the casks are first fill, sometimes they're refill casks. Anyway, you can look at the legs if you like, which tells you some of the little dribbles that come down. Tells you something about the likely texture.
Yes.
And then you nose it. You nose it for the first time, and the first thing you remark on is what's called the nose feel effect. So the actual physical effect that the spirit is having. This is mellow, but it has a very slight prickle. And that's useful to judge how much, because in the end, I'm going to add a little drop of water. And so I want to take off that prickle to open it up.
Yes.
So I nose, and I try and describe what I'm smelling. It's nose drying overall. It's got some deep sort of dried fruits, and almonds. I mean, a Christmas cake comes to mind.
Mm-hmm.
Lovely, rich, rounded aroma. And then I taste it. Usually I taste it, take a sip of water. I'll taste gin. Clean my palate. And then take a sip. Now, as with the nose feel effect, the first thing I look for is what's called mouth feel effect. So this has a creamy texture. Some whiskies can be slightly acerbic.
Yes.
Some can be mouth cooling. This is a nice, creamy, oily, sometimes they're called.
Yes.
It starts sweet. Then there's an interval of chocolate in mid-palate.
Okay.
Extraordinary. And then it dries towards the end with a little bit of spice, in the finish. So then I put in a drop of water, enough to open it up and to.
And you're just taking a small droplet thing, and
I literally,
a few drops.
usually use this, but I've found out water. But
Okay.
I use that. But I mean, like a teaspoon. You know, it's really as much as that.
Teaspoon,
just a little drop to start with. But you want to open it up, and and it has. You see, it's brought up the aroma. And then this time, when I taste, I'm going to hold it for much longer in my mouth. To really get to grips with what we call the balance of primary tastes, the sweetness, which tends to be picked up towards the front of the tongue, saltiness, sweet, sour, salty, and bitter. Sweetness at the front, salty, and what we would call acidic, or what in wine terms would be acidic, that's sour, and then bitter as you finish,
yes.
As it goes down. Again, lovely texture. With a little bit of water, of course, it makes it much easier to hold it in the mouth.
Yes.
It's reduced the sweetness, chocolate's still there, reduced the dryness. And it's got a long finish, long warming finish.
Right.
And chocolate in the aftertaste. So that's how you do it. That's
Excellent.
how you do it.
Excellent. Well, you've actually just made me feel rather thirsty, so I might just have a little dram of my own. As you can see,
nice wee glass. Look at that.
It's cut crystal in the shape of a thistle, which is actually quite sweet.
Very nice. And that would work quite well as a nosing glass because the rim narrows slightly. So you've got a nice bowl to swirl it.
Yes.
And the rim narrows very slightly. That's the key thing, to direct the aroma up your nose.
Yes. Well, thank you for that little lesson. That's unexpected, but very welcome. Thank you. As you know, in this particular podcast, I've talked about Whisky Regions. And some whiskey drinkers will revel in the fact that they've bought a particular whiskey from a particular region, sort of intimating that it's got a specific characteristic associated with that region. Do you believe to be true today about regions? What relevance do whiskey regions have in the 21st century?
The industry is trying to move away from regions. I should say that to start with, in that the science is understood so much better that they can create whiskies of a certain style anywhere in Scotland. Mm-hmm. The regions, well, but they cannot replicate. It's yet to be done to do a precise replication of the product of an individual distillery. That still defies science.
Right.
But having said that, the traditional regions, it has historical precedence, the whole regionality business, mm-hmm. Going back to the 1780s, when Scotland was divided for tax purposes and various other regulations, for distilling regulations, between the Highlands and the Lowlands. Yes. So what was called, you'll be familiar with the Highland Line. And I think that term was first used actually in relation of I think it was called the Wash Act of 1785. I think it was. Yep. There were two acts, but there were 1781 and 1785. Anyway, and there were different regulations above and below the line. So you had Highland whiskey and Lowland whiskey.
And the line you're talking about, is that the Highland boundary fault line from way up in Peterhead down to, in fact, Helensburgh actually runs all the way down?
Yeah, that's right. Okay. It's loosely speaking, approximately Dumbarton to Montrose.
Right.
And then it was moved. It came down from up from the Clyde, and then Aberdeenshire was excluded. So it went, if you like, it would go from Dumbarton to Nairn or something like that. Yes. But everything north and west of that was Highland, mm-hmm. And everything south and east of that was Lowland.
Yep.
And of course, as you well know, there were different linguistic traditions, different customs, different dress, even in those days.
Yes.
Except the kilt had been banned.
Right.
The above and below, and the distilling in the Highlands was always done from malted barley because they didn't have surplus crops.
Yep.
And always done in pot stills, and done perfectly. Private distilling was perfectly legal until 1781.
Yep.
When it was summarily banned. And so you had to have a license to distill. Mm-hmm. Of course, everybody had been doing it forever. And so they just went underground. And so hence the beginning of the serious beginning of the smuggling era, the illicit distilling era, dates from that time.
Yes.
So the style of whiskey made in the Lowlands tends to be different from that in the Highlands. The Lowland whiskey was... they used mixed grains and indeed in some cases even vegetables. And because the tax, by the late 18th century, tax was based upon the estimated amount of spirit that could be made from a still. And so what they did was invent stills with a very broad base, which could be flashed off. And so you could get, let's say the estimation that you could charge and discharge a still 3 times a day. Mm-hmm. Well, they were managing to do it in about 5 minutes,
Wow, okay.
So you get multiple discharges from but the spirit was filthy.
Yeah.
It was horrible. And and that was why it all went into punch. They would mix it with lemons and with because it was drunk straight from the still.
Right.
And it had, and a lot of this spirit was sent to England actually for rectification into gin. Mm-hmm. That became the base spirit for gin, and it was gin made in Scotland as well. But then comes the law was all changed in 1823, and it was made possible to make decent whiskey at a reasonable price. And so it encouraged previous illicit distillers to go legal.
Yes, I think tax was halved, wasn't it? I think.
It was at least. And the next significant date would be 1830, when the continuous still was invented. Mm. Now that became used to. It makes a very strong, a very pure, therefore somewhat tasteless. Think of vodka.
Yes.
spirit. It was adopted by a number of lowland distillers, but never really adopted in the Highlands.
Mm-hmm.
So you had a phenomenon where so the lowland whiskies tended to be lighter, and then with the advent of the so-called grain whiskey, i.e., not made entirely from malted barley, only about 20% of the mix was malted barley. You got very distinct style of whiskey in the lowlands, and then after 1860, the blending of the two styles, the grain whiskey and the malt whiskey, became mainly. So they were mainly wine and spirits merchants, the early blenders.
Yes.
And they were setting out to achieve. Andrew Usher in Edinburgh was the first, so beautifully the first, 1853. But you couldn't mix the two, grain and malt, without paying tax until 1860.
Yes.
And so that opened the floodgates. And what they were doing, they were setting out to produce a consistent product, a blend which was more appealing to a wider range of people, and repeat it again and again and again. So you can't, as you'd be aware, you can't brand unless you've got a consistent product.
Yes.
And so so then you got towards the latter part of the 18th century, you got the big brands like Dewar's, like Johnny Walker, like Bell's, like Grouse, etc., etc.
So that establishes the Highland Lowland, but we have 5 whisky regions, of course. You're looking at Speyside now, Campbelltown, and of course Islay. And one wonders how Campbelltown can survive with only 3 distilleries there.
Yeah, I once had 29 though. So what was being discerned by blenders by the 1880s were they divided the country up by regionality, and that was by the style of the spirit that was coming from Highlands, Lowlands, and then, as you say, Campbelltown and Islay. Speyside was not a separate region, and Speyside really came on the map in the 1890s, and they were making malts with a style which was very, very appealing to blenders, soft, sweet, easy drinking.
Yes.
And so then it became, it was never really called, it was not even called Speyside really until I would guess the 1960s. We called it Strathspey, it was called the Glenlivet style. These and a lot of distilleries attached the name to the Glenlivet word to their own name.
Yes.
Because it helped them sell the stuff, So that's how you got these 5. That's how the 5 regions came about, for blending purposes.
Right.
And so and unknown to the consumer, because the consumer in these days was drinking nothing but blended Scotch.
Yeah.
Very, very few. As blending took off big time in the 1890s, all the malt whiskey made, except for a tiny fraction, and that mainly sold locally, was all malt made went for blending.
Yes.
And that remained the case really. Well, the first company to start promoting their whiskey as a single malt was William Grant and Sons with Glenfiddich. That was in 1963. Right. And so there were malts around, but I mean, I have a book here that said that in 1930, malt whiskey was unknown, and it was a wonderful book. In fact, I would highly recommend it to you. Inez MacDonald, Whiskey. It would be my Desert Island whiskey book.
Okay.
It's a polemic against the whiskey industry, really.
I'll just repeat that. That's Inez
MacDonald.
Inez MacDonald, Roger.
It has been reprinted quite recently, and so it is available on Amazon or whatever it is.
Great. I will find it.
Wonderful book. Anyway, so for one reason or another, which I won't go into because it's too complicated, the Grants decided that they'd start promoting Glenfiddich. The rest of the industry looked on amazed. Who on earth would want to do that? Who on earth wants to drink malt whiskey when you've got blended Scotch? So they had what's called in advertising terms a first mover advantage of about 10 years.
Yeah.
And then some of the other smaller independent, they saw the huge success of Glenfiddich, which Grants had now by this time thrown Balvenie into the.
Of course, yeah.
They owned Balvenie as well.
Yeah.
So so a number of number of whiskies, but still only less than 1% of the malt whiskey made was bottled as single even by 1980.
Right.
But then you got a crisis because there was far too much whiskey being made, spirit being made. Then there was demand. There was a crash in demand. People were turning to white spirits, particularly Bacardi, white rum, and vodka.
Yeah.
And also in the UK, there was a lot of wine was given a lot of tax breaks after we joined the European community.
Yeah.
And whiskey was considered to be dad's drink, or indeed even grandpa's drink.
Yeah.
You know? So bad time. And 83, 85, a large number of distilleries closed. But then, lo and behold, people started to talk about malt whiskey. And one of the most astonishing things that you may not know, John, is the Maclean, which is now a global brand, and indeed Glenmorangie, the same,
Yes.
same, you know.
Yes.
They took note. They were remarking, even in the 60s, of the success of Glenfiddich, but they didn't start promoting they were setting aside stock for bottling as single malt.
Yes.
So they went to market. They started to promote it in 1981. You know,
Wow.
and that's not a long time ago, so far as you and I are concerned.
No,
you know?
no.
Astonishing. And you know, the guy that told me the first marketing director they appointed, a chap called Hugh Metcalf in 1978. In 1978, Macallan's entire promotional budget was £50 for the brand.
Well,
It all went for blending.
They've clearly been successful, because I was up there just at the back end of last year, and the new distillery with the fabulous eco roof, it's just phenomenal. And I think they've probably increased production by another 50% or something.
I would think that. Yeah, I think that's right. Yeah.
That's super. Thank you for that. The one thing I always want to ask about is when I go around Scotland, I visited a large number of distilleries. In fact, I think just over 50, and I always try and go around them, at least once. But it's incredible that each one creates a unique signature, especially as they all start with the same 3 ingredients. Now, some of the master maltmen will say it's the shape of the copper stills, the type of barrel used, even the way it's stored to produce that particular brand. For example, when you go to Islay, they'll say the sea air actually imbues the whiskey, because while the angel shares escaping, the sea air is getting in. So why do you think there is such a difference in Scotch whiskies, and what do you think is the greatest influence on the final taste?
Well, the influences are extremely complex. Briefly, the raw materials, do barley varieties make a difference? The industry says not really, although some would disagree with that.
Yeah.
So you've got the barley variety, and barley varieties are being changed all the time, really with a view to all sorts of things. But largely with a view to the amount of alcohol you can get per ton of barley. That's the key thing.
Yeah.
But also processability, as it's called, how easy it is to process it in the production. And agronomics, how much yield you can get, the farmers can get, so on. Water was always believed to be the key thing, because they didn't know any different. They didn't know what made this magical difference between one still and another. And it was they reckoned it was the water source. And indeed, many distilleries in the 19th century were built on the sites of former illicit stills, which were known to produce good water. Interesting enough, the Highland Park that you're drinking is made from hard water. They used to say that it's best made from soft water, but the Highland Park Glenkinchie, Glenlivet, the famous Glenlivet, is a mix of hard and soft, and the Glenmorangie is hard water, mineral rich, etc. So the water, does it make a difference? Well, by and large, most distillers will say no. Some say yes. Funnily enough, the temperature of the water in the condensers will make a difference. But anyway, and then yeast, and again, yeast is discounted in Scotland, not in Japan and not in America. They're very, very precious about their yeasts, and I think a lot of work is now being done on yeast. We can talk about the new emergent distilleries, perhaps later, but
Yes.
some of them are exploring how to develop flavor with different yeast style, different yeast types, etc.
Yeah.
So that's the, and then you get into the process, and there are every stage of the process well, not so much the early stages. Well, the first thing is malting, of course. So
Yes.
if you dry your green malts, it's called over peat, you're going to get a pronounced peaty flavor.
Yeah.
But you can actually make a very lightly peated malt but still dry it over a peat fire.
Yeah.
It seems contradiction in terms, but if you run your kiln very hot, you will limit the amount of the smoke, the phenols that stick to the husks and give that smoky flavor.
Yes.
So there are ways of doing peat. Drying over peat was the key mark of the keynote of Highland whiskies, including Speyside.
Mm-hmm.
But the Speyside, there was a guy called Charles Doig, who was an architect in Elgin, and he invented what was properly called the Doig ventilator, the pagoda.
Yes.
Pagoda top to the stills, which is now a hallmark of a malt whiskey distillery, and that was designed to increase the draft through, so and you could regulate it with louvers in the pagoda to contain the smoke or to expel it as quickly as possible.
Yep.
And so you could, with this device, you could make a relatively lightly peated malt with a peat fire, and that's what happened on Speyside. That was one of the reasons why Speyside developed that style.
Yes.
Which wasn't profoundly smoky.
Yes.
So that was very important. But during the process, the actual making, well, I don't want to go into the details.
No.
But the length of fermentations are very important. You can ferment. I don't go into the technicalities, but length of fermentations, how fast, how hard you run your stills, how high you charge them.
Yeah.
Whether, very important, whether you've got an old-fashioned worm tub condenser, which is a coil of copper coil in a big tub of water.
Yes.
That which was the traditional way, or most now have what they call shell and tube condensers, which are big canisters with multiple hundreds of small bore pipes.
I think Dalwhinnie.
You're right.
They've got the big barrels outside.
You've learned. Well, but Dalwhinnie took out its worm tubs and installed shell and tubes, and they didn't get the same spirit. So at great expense, they took out the shell and tubes and put back the worm tubs.
Well, the barrels are still there.
Yeah. Well, and they've got the worm tubs now. So it's all very handsome looking, and but so that plays a part on particularly on the weight of the spirit, the oiliness.
Yes.
I mean, people with worm tubs would say it's a more traditional style of spirit.
Yeah.
The condensers, the shell and tubes, they tend to produce a lighter style. It's all to do with the contact that the vapor has with
the copper.
With copper. You know, both in the still and in the condenser.
Yes.
But then the most important, no doubt, is the cask.
Right.
That cask contributes massively to flavor, the flavor of the overall flavor of the finished product.
Yeah.
Obviously, they have to be made from, well, now it used to be just wood, but they have to be made from oak wood now.
Mm-hmm.
Two kinds of oak are used: European oak or American oak. American oak tends to be seasoned with bourbon, so they're ex-bourbon casks.
Mm-hmm.
European with sherry. People talk loosely about sherry casks and bourbon casks.
Yes.
The contribution that the first incumbent makes is slight, particularly bourbon, may come through in the first fill, the first time it's been filled with spirit, with Scotch spirit. But the oak wood themselves, and of course then the number of times they've been filled with spirit, with Scotch spirit.
Yes.
So first fill, they're going to be much more active. And God, I'll tell you a story. Last night, was it last night or the night before? I think it was last night. I was talking to a distiller, a Deeside distillery and he produced 2 samples of very good coloured whiskey, and he said, let me have your opinion of these. And so I tasted them both, and they were superb, really, really superb whiskies. And we talked about each one, and I guessed them both to be about 18 years old. And one turned out to be a Glendronach 18, and the other was one of his own whiskies. It was 18 months old.
Wow.
I couldn't believe it. It was a perfectly mature whiskey.
Yeah.
In fact, I think I guessed it was between 20 and 18 years.
Yes.
But it was 18 months old. I mean, I was absolutely... It was matured in a very small cask.
Yes.
And a very active cask. You know, it was an ex-sherry cask.
Yes.
But it was very small. And you get a more rapid maturation in a smaller cask. But anyway... But I mean, that was humiliating for me. It's always good to be humiliating.
Is that a little bit worrying if you can actually now mature to that extent, to that quality in 18 months?
Yeah, well, it's not. I mean, you need to have the right wood, though, you see.
Of course.
And that's expensive. And so then there are other factors. You mentioned the saltiness of the atmosphere on Islay and but a lot of Islay whiskey actually is matured in the Central Belt. I mean, Kalila's all matured in the Central Belt. A lot of Lagavulins matured in the Central Belt and so on.
Yes.
But it still retains this maritime character and, of course, the peaty character.
Yeah.
So it does have that the ambient atmosphere of the warehouses may play a small part, but it's a relatively small part.
Yeah.
So that all these factors. And it's extremely difficult. You can't really imitate. I suppose that's why. I mean, there was a famous story about in the late 1890s, the Glengrant was doing terribly well, and so they built another distillery just across the road in Rothes called Glengrant No. 2, and and that failed. But the key thing was that it produced. Obviously, they copied the stills. They had the same malting regime, same source of water, and it produced different whiskey.
Wow!
And it wasn't as desirable as Glengrant No. 1.
Yes.
And it closed in 1900, and then was revived in the 1960s as Cappadonic. That Cappadonic's now closed and has been removed, and is now part of Rothes. They are part of Forsyth's. The still makers, that's
It's fascinating how we've moved on. In fact, I think I counted 132 or 133 distilleries at the moment, many of which were opened last year. I think I've counted 10. Do you think that Scotch whiskies moved with the times, especially with the new generation's approach to drinking whiskey, adding water and mixers? And I noticed that certainly the 10 I looked at last year or the year before, they were sort of relatively small, boutique-type distilleries. How do they compare with the big boys up in the Space side?
Well, there's several questions there, but it's very much market to market. Scotch whisky has a global market.
Yeah.
And markets, for example, I do quite a lot of work in Asia, in China and Taiwan, and particularly, and I've got 2 bars named after me in China, Charles Whiskey Bar, and
in Beijing,
one in Beijing and one in Hangzhou. But you see, it's interesting that the customer profile there is much younger than. Well, I'm not talking kids, but probably from about 25 through to 45, let's say, and and many more women.
Right.
Who enjoy whiskey. Same in France is similar in terms of female consumers.
Yeah.
So the traditional markets like the UK, like the US, Northern Europe, tends to be more sort of men and older men.
Yes.
After all, whiskey is an acquired taste. So you can't get around that.
Yep.
But the one thing that's made a big difference is the social media.
Yes.
Because now, and of course the kids, so-called, they're chattering away on social media, and so the exchange of information about whiskey I can't tell you the global enthusiasm for whiskey. That's why it's become such an important item in tourism in
Yes,
Scotland.
yes.
People become more so than beer drinkers or even wine drinkers. They become passionate about whiskey.
Yes.
Not only Scotch, but the non-Scotch, as we call it as well, Irish and American,
Yeah.
Japanese, etc. But the passionate about it. And if they're exchanging these ideas and their thoughts and their tasting notes and blah blah blah, which is all grist to the mill for the whiskey industry, generally speaking. Now, what was the other thing? Oh, no, now you're absolutely right. That by my count, I think you're right. I think that 32 new distilleries have opened since, or maybe 37 since 2004.
Right.
And I know of another 30 that are proposed.
Wow.
Now, some of those won't. This is unprecedented in the entire history of. And some of these are not toys; they're not small units.
Yep.
Some of them are sort of million liters of spirit per annum. But the smaller ones, I mentioned that the backbone of the industry was blended Scotch, and so the entire product of the malt whiskey distilleries was you would gear your production for a year on your so-called filling orders, the orders that you had. For blenders would say, "I want you to fill 100 casks for me this year," etc. And the whole production was geared to that, and still is in the sense that there's a lot of reciprocation,
Yes.
Exchanging casks and so on. But a lot of these newcomers, most of them will have to rely on selling their single malt as single malt.
Right.
It won't go. Very little will go for blending.
Yes.
Which will mean that there's going to be some very strong competition. But it also means that they've got to differentiate. They've got to find ways. It's very difficult to innovate in any obvious way, because the definition of Scotch whiskey, is very, very tight. It's the most tightly defined spirit in the world.
Yeah.
And that's for the simple reason that to a guarantee of the quality and character of Scotch. And so it's a good thing, but it does. Some distillers get very. I mean, for example, in America, they've got these horrible confections where they add honey or molasses or and they produce a drink which I think is horrible, but it's very popular. The Americans have a sweet tooth anyway, and it's very popular with younger drinkers. And so some Scotch distillers will say, "Why can't we do that?"
Yeah.
And the Scotch Whisky Association, which is the kind of governing body, says, "No, you can't do that, because that will change the true character of Scotch whisky."
Of course, some would argue that the addition of caramel, which is allowed, could have a slight difference. What's your take on that?
I've done experiments with caramels added. They used to use a thing called Paxaret, which is it's a vino cotto. It's a sherry which has been evaporated down to a completely thing. Yeah, and that was used as the colorant for tinting blends and things. The blenders loved it. It added a certain amount of sweetness. Spirit caramel. So that was banned in 1990, I think. The Paxaret, but the spirit caramel was then allowed, and it was deemed to be, as they say, organoleptically inert. It had no smell or taste.
Yeah.
Now that actually is not true, because if you add even a tiny drop to water, you can smell it and it tastes extremely bitter.
Right.
It's like saccharin. Do you know what I mean?
It's
not. Doesn't bestow a sweet taste, which is the other way around. But I have done experiments with it, and it is extremely difficult to discern. So these experiments with about 10 whiskey samples, and I was asked to someone would pour 2, and then they would add. Well, no, there was 3 actually. They would add 4 got and you were blindfolded. There were no spirit caramel, 2 drops of spirit caramel, 5 drops of spirit caramel, 7 drops of spirit caramel.
Yeah.
And you were blindfolded, so you couldn't tell by color. You just had to do it by nose and taste. And I tell you what, it was just, and the whiskies ranged from Rosebank, which is a very light lowland whiskey, to Beaumont, which is a smoky Islay whiskey.
Yeah.
And it was extremely difficult. Really, I scored about 60%, 65%, but I was never fully confident. And I was only one of several experts, so-called.
Yes.
And all of them, we posted our results and shared our results. And everybody said that they felt slightly humiliated because they did not. So what I can say is that the amount of spirit caramel that's used is very small and very difficult to discern.
Yeah.
But it completely ruins the possibility of looking at the color and saying, oh, that's come from an American oak cask, that's come from a refill sherry cask, etc. Some distilleries, of course, I mean, there is generally a move, certainly in malt whiskies. Maclean has never, to my knowledge, or they all say that they never used spirit caramel.
Yeah.
They rely on the color coming from the cask. And
yes.
So I mean, I think it's unfortunate, but I think it's for cosmetic reasons. You know, if the consumer wants consistency of color, if he's used to buying a particular whiskey, whether it's a blend or a malt, and expects that sort of color, and lo and behold, there's a difference. He thinks, what's going on here? You know.
So it's more for consistency of color, and that's all.
Right. Yeah. Okay.
Super. We've just touched upon different whiskies of the world there, and can you just give me your take on other whiskies, Japanese, American, Canadian, and how does it compare with our very wonderful Scotch?
Well, I think the important thing, John, the important thing to remember is that the first thing I would say categorically is that one is not necessarily better than the other. I happen to prefer Scotch, but it's not necessarily better, necessarily.
Yep.
And really, they should be compared from a flavor perspective. They should be compared within their category. So you compare, American bourbons, American rye, American blended whiskey, etc., within its category. And Irish whiskey, you see Pure Pot Still, which was the traditional Irish whiskey, is fantastic. Green Spot, Redbreast is my favorite. Is better, I think, than it's a different category. It's like saying, well, even in Scotch, it's like saying that malt is better than blend.
Yep.
Not really. It's a different product by design. But the key thing to remember is that all these whiskies, Japanese whiskey and so on, they're made with extraordinary skill and patience. And by design, the flavors that they're not random products. The flavors that the master blenders or the master distillers want, they go to great lengths to achieve that.
Yep.
You know?
Yes.
So as I say, I'm a Scotch drinker.
Yeah, I suppose it's personal taste as well.
It is, and I suppose in certain circumstances, if I'm in Ireland, I'll drink Irish whiskey, of course. And I wouldn't usually have a bottle of Irish in the house.
No. Well, of course, if you're in Ireland drinking Irish whiskey, hopefully somebody else is buying it for you as well.
Yeah.
Well, that's great. Charlie, I've just got one final question. You've already told us if you're on Desert Island Discs, the book you take with you. Can you just tell me what bottle of whiskey you would take?
Well, it may come as a surprise, John. I would take Johnny Walker Black Label.
Okay.
So although my work is mainly to do with malt whiskey, I drink blended Scotch for pleasure.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, the dram that I will reach for at 6:00 this evening will be a blend.
Yes.
I suppose it's because malt is my work, and the blend is just where I can just forget about it. I just enjoy it.
Yeah.
And of all the blend, well, again, it's somebody else. I mean, I used to say if somebody else is buying Johnny Walker Black Label, then I don't have. I'm not supplied masses or any from Diageo.
Yeah. Yeah.
But it is interesting. I was the first editor of Whisky Magazine, and part of my job was I had to write a little article in each issue, interviewing someone in the trade, whether they were retailers or distillers or management or whatever, and across American whiskies and certainly in relation to Scotch whiskey production. And my final question was always, apart from the whiskey that you make or you're involved with, which one do you have the highest regard for? Mm-hmm. And I tell you, 80% said Johnny Walker Black Label.
Really?
So I was confirmed that it's a wonderfully consistent product. I love it. I can drink it like mother's milk.
Well, thank you for that. I might just have a wee dram myself. I followed my father's footsteps. He was a man for the great famous grouse from Glenturret. But well, Charlie, it's been an absolute privilege to have you on the podcast, and I'm sure my listeners will have been delighted to hear from Scotland's leading whisky expert, to quote the Times, and one with such a love of Scotland and the national drink. So, Charlie, thank you so much for joining us today.
My pleasure, John. Thank you. I've enjoyed our conversation. Thank you very much.
That was super. Thank you.
Great. No, it was great fun. I enjoyed it very much. Yeah.
Yeah, we just gassed away. But it was my dad's favourite was the grouse, and I followed.
My dad's was teachers for some reason.
Yeah.
But I mean, the people that they drank the blends were where it was at.
Yeah, absolutely. My old man was a miner, and if you went to the miners' club, it was the bells or grouse, basically. Another nice little tipple too. But my favourite is Highland Park, and the reason for that is because I was the navigating officer of HMS Orkney.
Oh, really? Yeah.
Offshore patrol vessel, and we regularly went into Kirkwall, and we got to know the owners of Highland Park. We're often taken round on trips.
Yeah.
I remember a Colonel Robertson and a Colonel McRae. They were involved in the distillery in some way, and we had a couple of bottles actually. I got a nice present from one of my clients before he left to go back to America, and that was the Highland Park 21-year-old.
Oh, great! Yeah, great.
Which I shook his hand vigorously, as you can imagine.
Well, look, if ever you're in Edinburgh, John, and fancy a pint of beer or a dram here, just
Fabulous.
Give me a shout. The bar opens at 12. And then it opens at 6.